Today we're answering the question, with AMD's RX580 now being available in even the sub £30 and $30 region, is this really the best graphics card you can buy, even if you're taking a chance on one that hasn't been tested? Right, so I mentioned in my last video that I'd picked up an RX580 for just north of 20 quid. And it did arrive in this actually quite nicely packaged parcel, but from that video that I just put out on the RX460, lots of people were curious on how the RX580 is doing, because we've never looked at one on this channel, and given how many people are asking, I thought, you know what, why don't we bring this video forward so we can actually take a look at the card. So the card itself cost me about £22.78, at least according to my eBay receipt here, which makes this surprisingly good value, given that the RX460 we also looked at was going for about the same price. And that's very literally the point I was making in that video, is that you can get these for next to nothing, as long as you're looking at auctions and not looking at the buy it now price. And saying that, the buy it now price on these is also fine. But why don't we get this thing open, see what it's actually showed up as, and see if it actually works. Because I must admit, the listing did say it had a couple of odd faults, but it did say it was a working graphics card. But then again, we've also looked at graphics cards with weird faults and they didn't work. It's a Sapphire version, 8GB GDDR5 with an overclock mode and dual BIOS. Well, this is our RX580, so we've got a Sapphire Pulse version. I think Pulse was the cheaper option on the range, but it is at least the 8GB version. And you can see what they were advertising at the time. DirectX 12, that's still relevant. Vulkan, that's still relevant. I didn't realise there was a FreeSync 2 at some point, but that's also probably quite relevant. And Relive, which I don't think anyone bothers using, they just use OBS, but some people did. What else have we got? The Heart, the Beat, the Game Pulse. That's a bit of a crap slogan, to be honest. Nothing too exciting here. It's got the specifications of the card. Well, let's just make sure the card is actually in here. We've got the box in the box. We've got our installation guide, and then I'm assuming this is our graphics card here. We've got anything else in there? No, we've not got like a driver disc, but I don't even think these came with a driver disc. So here is the graphics card itself, and it's an actual RX580, unlike the last one we ordered that was actually just a knockoff of one of these that was completely broken. It was a fun video, but it wasn't exactly great for performance, and this looks much better built. I can actually see it's got VRAM cooling already. Doesn't look like it's got any physical damage, because even then the last one didn't. Still got the non-tamper screw stickers on there, which is a good sign, and it's still got most of the graphics card plugs. It looks like whoever owned this actually kept it in nice condition, so if there is anything wrong with it, it might just be overheating. At this point, this is a nearly 10-year-old graphics card still running the original thermal paste. Let's get a PC out, plug it in, and see if this thing actually works, because this one might be bargain of the year. 22 quid, RX580 in box. Well, it's got to be said that I've never really been a huge fan of the RX580 series. My reasoning why I've never been a huge fan was it was nothing more than overvolted version of the RX480. It took away all the advantages Polaris 1 had, threw it all away for the sake of 3 extra frames per second, which was at the time a very AMD thing to do. Why not release it as power efficient and, you know, a good card on the market when you can crank it full of voltage and get 3 extra frames per second out of it? So undervolting is going to have to be something we do if this works. It must be said, it fits in well with the backdrop, the box at least, so at least we got a funky box out of this. Still not quite beating Robot the Robot over there though in the corner. But I am just curious how it compares to the likes of the RX480. Because in terms of best value cards we bought this year, this RX480, which was what, 3 months ago now, it was 32 quid. And yes, it's a reference model with a sketchy fan, but this is currently the best value card we've bought all year. So this one could be better. Robot, no. Right, before I plug in anything else at all though, we are going to see if it turns on and if we get a signal out of it. Now I am using HDMI, so we'll see if it just displays out of the box just immediately. Oh wait, we need a 6-pin. Attempt 2, now it's actually plugged in. No untoward noises. Please don't tell me that this actually just straight up works. System was booted in safe mode, that's fine. Can it make it to Windows? It may actually just immediately use the drivers that are on here. Let's see if we make it through to Windows. Currently got a black screen, isn't promising. I can see that it's sending a display signal. Try a restart. This may be where it goes wrong, but it could just be something like BIOS corruption or something like that. I mean, it's meant to have an interchangeable BIOS on it. Okay, we're booting to the desktop. Okay, we're at the desktop. What graphics card does it say we have? Now, it's probably launching on the modified drivers that were already on here, so this may be wrong. Okay, it's not launched with any drivers at all, which is a bit surprising given this is already running Polaris drivers. It's detected AMD HD audio device, so the HDMI on it's working. Does GPU-Z tell us anything? Nothing at all. It's not even giving us Microsoft Basic Display Adapter, it's just giving us blank. Okay, it can't find any compatible drivers, which is a bit of a weird thing. But we'll go through, we'll uninstall all the drivers that are on here, we'll reboot the system and then try with some fresh drivers again. I mean, to be fair, we knew there'd be something funky going on, because we did boot straight into a system that has been running, admittedly, a lower-end Polaris card, but also with a funky driver situation going on. So this could be entirely plausible. This might not be the fault of the card. Just usually if you've got AMD drivers present, it does usually tend to detect them. I mean, you can see there, INF section Polaris. I'm hoping no one's used this card for mining or something like that and whacked a custom BIOS on there, because we can clear it. It's just a bit of a pain to do so. But we'll get these removed, and then once we've got these removed, we'll run through the installer, and then fingers crossed, it actually does something and it wants to work. Right, so we should just be able to go ahead now and install the latest AMD drivers that I have got downloaded. And don't worry, of course, I will test at the end of the video the modified drivers. Admittedly, we did see a bit of an uptick on the RX460 graphics card, but last time I tested one of these higher-end Polaris cards, we saw no improvement, pretty much just no change whatsoever. So now comes the moment of truth. Does the RX580 for £22 actually work? Because if this does, this pretty much goes to show that there is no need to buy any other cheap graphics card when the RX480, and by extension the RX580, are so cheap. At some point I will cover the RX590, but I have some very strong thoughts on that graphics card that I will share for another video, because honestly, bit underwhelming there from AMD. It was named like a flagship, but once again, it was the rebrand of the rebrand, slightly shrunk. Oh, that was promising. And also really speedy. That was about 30 seconds if it actually did install the drivers. I'm beginning to think whoever sold this graphics card might have just not had it plugged in properly, because if they were having problems with it cutting out, I would have said it would have done it by now. It's installed. RX580, Ellesmere 14nm, 2017 graphics card, we knew that. 2,304 shading units. Well, we'll restart, see if it makes it back to Windows, and then it's time to get some figures, get some numbers. I genuinely think that we've got bargain of the year here. I have no better way of describing it. If this actually works, we're sorted, we're done. How do we top this for value? I know, like, the cheap graphics cards, like an odd £1 or £2 graphics card, are like fun and technically good value. This is an actual gaming powerhouse that has cost us nothing. Okay, maybe I get why people are a little bit excited to see this video, because even I am a little bit excited to see this video. I've lost USB. Oh, are we back? Keyboard is dead as well. Okay, so it's messing with the USB a little bit, which is a tad weird, but we'll get a 3D mark reading for a couple of reasons. One, we can actually see if it survives the test, and two, it gives us a baseline figure, and it also tells us if this thing needs repasting or anything like that at all. We're this close to finding out if this graphics card works. We're not going to be running Steel Nomad, we just want to run Time Spy. I take it MSI Afterburner's open. MSI Afterburner is open, so we can monitor the temperatures. Got a slight whiff of a burning smell. Usually, if a card makes it through this, it's stable. Performance seems okay. Coil whine has started from the graphics card. What else have we got? GPU temperature is rising. It is rising quite quickly. We're up to 66 degrees, 67, 68. Yeah, already up to 70 degrees. Okay, it's getting very hot very quickly. 80 degrees. It did throttle there for a second. I don't usually do a live commentary over 3D Mark, so I do think maybe thermals might be one of the reasons he was having problems with it. But these cards were very overvolted from the factory, so it could just be a case of it's simply running a ton of voltage through it to get this performance, and we might be able to just undervolt it and bring it all back. So we'll let it run through this, see what kind of results we get. It seems stable enough, albeit a little bit hot. I think we've got a cheap working RX580, and it might just need thermal paste. That's a win. So the results are in, and straight out of the box we're seeing the card performing bang on average. The average score is 4,738, we scored 4,747. That is about bang on where I expected performance to be, but the thermals are a little bit out of control. You probably can't hear it because I do tidy up the audio from these sections, but the fan is still very, very angry. So it seems to reach 81 degrees as its peak temperature, and that's when it starts to throttle, I'm assuming. Yeah, it does start to throttle a little bit. So we can definitely sort that out with an Undervolt. This is a very common RX580 problem. I'm hoping the Undervolt sorts out the thermals, because tearing down some of these larger cards just takes such a long time. I mean, look at this estimated game performance. Usually it just says unknown. Even here, Battlefield 5, 1440p Ultra. That's what it's assuming for the games we can run on it. Let's do some undervolting and crack on with the rest of the video. Well, I have left it running a little bit of a stress test for a while, and it passed it absolutely fine. So I'm going to say we're good to go ahead and try and do a little bit of undervolting. So if we just go through the AMD drivers, go to performance, tuning. This is not a tutorial on how to undervolt, but if you do want to get something out of it, this is pretty much what I do. I run Unigine Valley at, if it's a modern graphics card like this, full resolution, everything turned up to the highest, just to put some load on the card. Then what we want to do is go to the AMD drivers, and as we can see here, it's using 151 watts, which is very high for Polaris. That is probably why it's getting hot rather than the thermal paste of that kind of power consumption. We want to turn our power limit up to the maximum. Then we want to go to GPU clocks, advanced control, scroll down to voltages and enable them. We'll copy the 1112 clocks all the way across. See if it's stable at 1112. It would appear to be stable, and it has brought our power consumption down by 20 watts. We're also now maxing out at 79 degrees rather than 80, so it's not hitting a brick wall. 1075, power consumption still dropping, temperature's also dropping, which is nice to see. Yep, we're down to 117 watts power consumption, same clocks. If anything, better performance. And this is what I mean when I say the RX580 and I have a controversial opinion on them. Because why is this thing drawing so much power when it doesn't need it? We're not getting a single speck of artifacting either, so we're going to try and go until we crash. So if we save that to the desktop, we'll save that as RX580, and we'll try and do a 1015, drop another 15 millivolts. Usually I just film these bits without any narration, just sort of go through and say what I've done, but when it comes to Polaris, so many people have asked me, how do I do this? And it's literally doing this until it crashes. Case in point there, it crashed. So we can do about 1030 millivolts, and that's probably about where we'll call it quits, and then I'd say we're all good. So it's a good thing we saved that profile, because now all we have to do is import that RX580 file to get back to where we were. Yep, 1030 millivolts, same clocks, increase the power limit, and now we'll run it through 3D Mark again. I know this range, the pulse range, was the cheaper end of Sapphire's options, and it is a very nice cooler. There's a couple of heat pipes on there, but they don't look like copper ones, so I'm assuming this is dealing with quite a lot of power for an all-aluminium cooler. But we'll run this through, make sure it's stable, and then, honestly, that's as simple as it is when it comes to undervolting these cards. You just keep going until it crashes, and then raise it up to where it's stable. But as you can see there, performance is now better, and our thermals are now in the 60 to 70 degree region with much lower fan noise than they were before. So we're all good, other than the fact it crashed. So we'll go up a little bit from there, but so what we'll do is we'll try a 1040, just an extra 10 millivolts across the range, and then we'll try that again. So we should be all good to go, but we might give it a quick clean and see if we get any extra performance from cleaning it, but it looks in really good condition, to be honest. So yes, it does in fact look like we have a working RX580 graphics card for about £22. And honestly, when it comes to the pricing of these cards, that really isn't an exceptional bargain, as I've been going through the completed listings on eBay, there are people taking admittedly more of a gamble than I did on sketchier looking graphics cards, getting them much cheaper than this. Now, last time we tried that, we really didn't have much success, with it being a Chinese knockoff version that had no VRAM cooling and had apparently burnt itself to death due to having a mining BIOS installed on it, so fairly self-explanatory how that one managed to end up not working. But this one, on the other hand, was working absolutely fine, and thanks to a quick undervolt, or at least my basic attempt at an undervolt, which has tended to work rather well for me, I think we're running in the end with about 1050 millivolts, which is a substantial amount lower than what it was out of the box, so it was quite a stable card even at low voltages. But just what kind of performance increase did we get from doing that? Well, straight off the bat, we
saw that we went from a score of 4,383 up to 4,532. Now this might not sound like much of an increase, but this was a much stabler experience overall, as the boost clocks just remained solid rather than thermally throttling themselves back like they were doing under their stock loads. So you would get extra performance and lower power consumption and less heat. In terms of how this actually compares to other graphics cards on the market, well, it pretty much lines up with, as you'd expect, the mid-range of Polaris, where it's performing pretty much the same as an RX480, makes sense, it's the exact same card, but it is also getting rather close to the AMD Radeon R9 Fury, one of my favourite flagships and one that we've heard plenty about. Despite this though, it was a good score. It was still around 2,000 points off an RTX 3050, well 1,500 points, I'm being a bit cynical there, and compared to a modern flagship card, well mid-range card now, like the Radeon 6700 XT, it's coming in around a third of the score. So it's not doing too badly, but it's just letting you know that it really isn't competing against modern cards. So why am I just a little bit cynical about the RX580? Because we're not denying the fact that for £22, anyone that knows this graphics card, even despite the fact I've not tested one myself, knows that is an awful lot of power to get for that money. You are getting a very solid graphics card, and the specifications of it aren't bad. I mean, it comes in based on the Polaris architecture, 2,304 cores, 144 TMUs, 32 ROPs, and most variants you'll see on sale today will at least be the 8GB version, which is GDDR5 memory running through a 256-bit memory bus. But as exciting as all this is, one of the reasons that I'm a tad pessimistic about it, and you've probably already gathered already, is this is nothing more than an RX480 with the clocks bumped up and the voltages bumped up with it. It was purely AMD's way of saying, look at our new release, it's getting 3 FPS more, and that's just enough to put it in front of the GTX 1060, which meant that your power consumption went through the roof, your thermals went through the roof, and even on a card like this, which is in remarkably good condition, is just thermally throttling out of the box, whether it's due to power limits, thermals, or just the fan curves not being set up properly. These cards are running far too much voltage. If they were released as a cheaper rebrand with the voltages that they should have, as most people are running these undervolted, I'm sure I'd be a lot less cynical about it. But part of me is a bit annoyed at the RX580 because lots of people still don't realise the RX480 is the RX580. And we're not going to go into the RX590 at this point, but it's pretty much the same card but die shrunk again. Polaris was a bit of a rebrand hell for a little bit, and the RX580 doesn't really represent the best of it personally. I think it just detracts from how good Polaris was on its launch. Either way, that's enough of going on a tangent there. What you need to know is, it's still a decently powerful graphics card, albeit a rebrand with some interesting choices made. So we are testing the AMD Radeon RX580 against plenty of popular titles out there, and some brand new AAA titles, everything we can do just to give you a good ballpark figure on how this graphics card performs. You know how the benchmarks work, we get some classic titles in there, and we also go with some of the most played games out there just to give you an idea of how they're performing. Now, we are running it with the latest available AMD drivers, which are the stock drivers, which I believe don't include optimizations anymore, but do include bug fixes. So they are at least supported somewhat, compared to at least older cards than this. Just you're not going to be getting the latest game optimizations. For those people that do want optimizations, well, I have done some testing later on in the video, not just against the RX480 to prove a point, but also using the R.I.D modded drivers. They used to be the Nemez team drivers, they rebranded to R.I.D. I've done some testing later on in the video in case people are interested in those results, but really, you're going to be better off using the stock drivers most of the time, as there's not too great of a performance deficit. But with all of that nonsense and mumbo-jumbo out of the way, just how good is the RX580 for £22? These things cost nothing now when we throw it up into the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with the very high preset, plus HBAO enabled in 1440p. Now, the reason we've gone for 1440p here is because originally I did have this hooked up to a 1080p monitor, and it simply wasn't stressing the card out enough. We were seeing anywhere from 60 to 80 FPS, and I wanted to get just a tad more performance out of it, at least in terms of visuals. Now, I have forgotten just how good 1440p can look after some of the dirge we've tested on this channel, but it was a very good looking experience with 46 FPS on average, and incredibly stable frame times down to 41 FPS. It's worth noting noting this is thanks to the RX580, well RX480, and its exceptional performance in Vulkan and Linux. Generally, it takes advantage of them so well, and with 8 gigs of VRAM, you're going to run into no problems here. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, actually perfect on the RX580. You just don't get any ray tracing here. Moving back to the legacy version of GTA 5, and we saw that these cards just absolutely dominated in this title. The amount of people buying into Polaris so they could play GTA 5, well the legacy version at the time, at its highest settings, was through the roof, and you can kind of see why, because even 4K would run absolutely fine on the RX580 here. Ultra high settings with all the advanced options turned on with AMD CHS shadows in 1440p netted us 64 FPS on average, with rather competent frame times down to 53 FPS. Now it's got to be worth noting that I don't think the legacy version, it just doesn't look quite as good as the enhanced edition does, now that we've actually got a somewhat like-for-like comparison going on between the clips. So yeah, GTA 5 Legacy works fantastic if that's what you want to play, but when you can manage the enhanced edition so well, I'd probably opt for that version on an RX580. Going into the online version of GTA 5 with the legacy version of GTA Online with the same settings we used in single player, and we still saw 61 FPS on average. Now our frame rate could fluctuate more here as we were in a higher lobby, and we did see some utilization problems with the card dropping down from anywhere from 70 to 80% when lots of players were on screen, in turn netting us a frame rate that bounced between 40 and 50 FPS. When you were in smaller and lighter situations, this figure would often hover around 60 to 70 FPS, but as we know, the netcode in this game goes absolutely insane over 16 players and can cause major utilization problems. Once again though, in smaller lobbies, you'd see a better frame rate than the single player experience, as you'd expect from GTA Online at this point, so it doesn't matter whether you're playing alone with friends or if you're playing in a fully packed out lobby, you will always be getting a fully playable experience from GTA Online. Given that we already had the 1440p monitor plugged in, I did decide to give Counter-Strike 2 a go with the competitive settings in 1440p. Now 1440p in this game did prove remarkably intensive, but not intensive enough to take us away from having a rather competitive frame rate, with 144 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 88 FPS. Now during this benchmark section, people have asked if I could actually start testing Nuke and some of these newer maps, just to see if there's any performance disparity. And I can quite comfortably tell you that when testing newer maps like Nuke, there is no problem whatsoever. The frame rate pretty much stays exactly the same as it did through this rather intensive workshop benchmark. I know the workshop benchmark takes place on Dust 2, but there are so many effects going on that, trust me, this is a really intensive, it's just more intensive than the game itself. So Counter-Strike 2 is very good in 1440p. If you want to net back a few extra frames, I say a few, probably about 40 to 60 extra frames, you can drop back to 1080p and get an even more competitive experience. BeamNG, even on the RX580, couldn't quite manage ultra settings in 1440p, so we did have to drop things back to the high preset, which isn't really a problem because this game looks fantastic all the way down to its low settings. It's so when you start cranking things lower than that down to their lowest, it starts to look a little bit questionable in places. But here, with the high preset in 1440p in the jungle benchmark map, we saw 34 FPS on average and a relatively stable set of frame times that saw us 31%, 1% lows down to 31 FPS. So BeamNG was more than playable, even in its most intensive situations. You drop things back to normal and high, and you can get anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS in the same set of situations. So depending on what you're after, frame rate or visuals, you can configure the RX580 to where you need it to be. You could always even drop the resolution. Next up, we have a special request from one of our YouTube members at the Atanium tier, which honestly, I wasn't expecting anyone to do, but thanks to Lane from the Brock Community channel, who has decided to choose Deep Rock Galactic, so I've gone ahead and bought that and downloaded it, and I've tried to do my best to benchmark it here, utilizing the highest settings plus the experimental options in DirectX 12. This was also done in 1440p, and throughout simpler situations in the tutorial we are seeing anywhere from 70 to 90 FPS. After I played through a little bit of the game, probably very poorly, so I do apologise, I've gone through and actually managed to get myself into a busy situation with lots of particle effects and things attacking me and me dying about 5 times over and over again, where we saw 58 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 42 FPS. So thank you very much to Lane for actually contributing to the channel and choosing this benchmark, and it worked pretty good. Now, this one was a bit of a tricky one, as I've taken to benchmarking Oblivion Remastered in a bit of a harder to run area. Now that I've done a full video dedicated to trying to run the game, I've got a bit of a better grip on how hard this game is to run in certain areas. So what I've done is decide to benchmark the game throughout the starting area, which proves remarkably intensive, and a few of the surrounding areas just to get an idea of how this game will perform at its worst. So with a mixture of low and medium settings using the 900p resolution, we did actually get the game very playable. The problem is some people are going to be saying, why aren't we using FSR or something like that? Well, when I was utilizing FSR, it didn't matter whether it was the AMD provided version, the Intel provided version, which was slightly better to be fair, there was just so much shimmering and ghosting that I just preferred running the game in a lower resolution to watching the things I was doing ghost themselves over the screen. So Oblivion Remastered will be playable depending on your preferences. You can stick to 1080p or 1440p with FSR, but personally if you don't want the ghosting, these are the kind of settings you're going to have to use. City Skylines 2 was also a very difficult game for the RX580 to run. Even utilising these very low settings, well, just low settings really, the game was using between 5 and 7 gigabytes of VRAM, meaning the lower VRAM version of this card wouldn't even be able to run this game at low settings in 1080p. It was just about playable here, with frame rates eventually stabilising in and around the 30 FPS region, but anytime something new was loaded in for the first time, you would see a frame drop or a spike, which gave us our 1% lows down to 19 FPS. Now, being a city builder, it is fully playable like this, and there are still a remarkable amount of details in this game even at the low preset. But that doesn't change the fact that it's not exactly particularly good looking when you're zoomed out for something that should be able to run better on an RX580. The highly requested game Palworld here, running with medium settings in 1080p. Now, it actually worked fairly well here. I did try and play the game for about 5-10 minutes, just donking things with a stick and sending, I think it's a sheep, after them. I was doing that for a little bit. But with the medium settings in 1080p, we saw 43 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 34 FPS. This really is one of those games that I probably need to spend a bit more time playing to get a good idea of how intensive it is to benchmark, but from the areas I've tested so far, it seems to be once you spawn in on this game, this is the frame rate you'll be seeing. It doesn't tend to fluctuate too much depending on what's going on. It's just one of those games that sort of plateaus at a performance level. So Palworld is playable, provided you don't mind medium settings and a 40 FPS frame rate. Now, I could not for the life of me get Baldur's Gate 3 stable at all with the Vulkan render option. At first I thought maybe it's my Undervolt and this game's too intensive, but given what we've tested previous to this, you'd think if the Undervolt was the problem, it would have made itself prominent in something like Oblivion Remastered or Counter-Strike 2, which is something that will just be pushing high frame rates. But no, Baldur's Gate 3 didn't matter whether you're running without an Undervolt, with the Undervolt, with stock settings, it simply wouldn't work on Vulkan. And this seems to be something that I've noticed on AMD cards since its last update, so I don't know if they need to fix something on their side, but I can't get it working for me. So with DirectX 11 we saw 50 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 38 FPS, utilising a mixture of medium and high settings. Honestly, your best way of playing this on a card like this, if you can't use Vulkan, is probably to cap the frame rate at 30 and crank up the resolution of the settings and enjoy a perfectly capped experience. To move things back into the world of optimization, Mount & Blade Bannerlord defaulted itself to a mixture of high and very high options in 1440p, so I was more than happy to oblige once more to what seems to be the world's best auto-detect function I've ever discovered in a game. We saw 60 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 36 FPS during the rather intensive built-in benchmark. I'm sure by those of us that have watched this channel by now know that this is once again reminiscent of the late game, and for smaller battles and scenarios you'd see well over the 60 FPS figure, and even then, during the late game you're still going to be seeing 60 FPS on average. So Mount & Blade Bannerlord looks and runs great in a 1440p resolution, with no problems here on the RX580. Cyberpunk 2077, I already knew what settings I wanted to use because I nicked them straight out of my RX480 video, and that is with low textures and a mixture of medium and high options in the 1080p resolution. Now, some people found this option controversial last time, saying, well, you've got 8 gigs of VRAM. Yes, VRAM doesn't equal the power of the card. If it looks and runs better with low textures and nice settings to cover them up, that's probably how you want to play the game. You could alternatively go for medium textures and low everything else, but it's just going to look worse. So this is probably the best way to play it on an RX580 or an RX480. Well, through the built-in benchmark we saw 43 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 35 FPS, but as we know this isn't all too reminiscent of the game itself. The actual gameplay of the game saw itself run around 2 FPS worse in terms of average, and once again 2 FPS worse in terms of our 1% lows. So Cyberpunk 2077 was pretty much perfect whether you were running the in-game benchmark or actually running it through some gameplay itself. Just, I found these settings to be the best option for you. I absolutely despise running Red Dead Redemption 2, as benchmarking this game is a monumental pain. But it decided to default to a mixture of high and ultra settings in 1440p. I thought, you know what, rather than spending the next decade trying to configure this game to actually work, we'll just run with those settings. And it made a fairly good call here, thanks to actually having 8 gigs of VRAM here does actually let you change the settings. Red Dead Redemption's a nightmare anyway, but it was very playable here with 42 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 37 FPS. So Red Dead Redemption 2 looks and runs fantastic, just you're going to want to run with high and ultra settings, but good luck configuring them yourself. People always love to see at least one Creation Engine game included, so I decided to run Fallout 4 because it is just wild and you never know how it's going to perform. And how did it decide it wanted to perform here? Well, running with ultra settings in 1440p runs at a perfectly smooth and locked 30 FPS. That's right, it just caps itself to 30 FPS. I tried driver-side tweaks, turning off VSync, manually configuring the game. No matter what I did, Fallout 4 decided that nope, it likes 30 FPS today. It's never really much of a relevant or comparable benchmark because Fallout 4 is entirely random with how it runs most of the time. But yeah, 30 FPS locked, it looked pretty good. Just you can only be seeing 30 frames per second. And even then, the utilization on the card was spiking anywhere from 40 to 100% depending what was going on, so who really knows? I did decide to run Rust with the medium settings in 1440p because that seemed to be a somewhat appropriate choice for a game like this. It did take a little while for things to actually load in around us, but that could be a mixture of this game's optimization, the fact my internet's terrible and it's loading things and details in, and this was also running through a combination of online gameplay as well as the built-in benchmark, because once again, for those of you that didn't know, Rust has one of the most comprehensive built-in benchmarks of any recent title I've looked at. So Rust was actually a pretty good experience and fairly competitive with 60 FPS on average. I suppose you could drop it down to low settings, but you wouldn't really benefit from too much of a performance gain. So yeah, Rust is pretty good and pretty playable. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, it probably goes as no surprise that yes, in fact it can run Crysis really quite well with 70 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 59 FPS while using ultra settings in DirectX 10. I have to include DirectX 10 there because a lot of modern Nvidia cards cannot launch Crysis without external workarounds. Nvidia could fix that, but they've decided not to. AMD has issues on some cards, but not these older Polaris ones. So Crysis will work, and subsequently that means that virtually any older game that is remotely intensive will work perfectly fine with ultra settings in higher resolutions. That's why Crysis is included, because it's a good benchmark that covers we have modern gaming and everything before included with Crysis, because if it can run that, it can run what came before it. So yes, Crysis is playable and looked good too. So the overall performance of the RX580, well, it certainly isn't bad by one bit. I mean, you look at the performance on show here, and every game we tested within reason was at least playable. I mean, some of those latest and greatest games like City Skylines 2 and Oblivion, which do tend to be a bit of a great filter into graphics cards that are still usable today, and ones that are relegated to the past, will run provided you're moderate with the settings. So it is actually fairly decent. I mean, the Oblivion performance was a little bit wayward in places, places. I like benchmarking that outside area now because it is that much more intensive than causing trouble in the towns and cities. And it does go to show that we did have to reduce our resolution scale down to 900p unless we really fancy turning on something like FSR. Personally, for me, FSR in this game, I just find it to have so much ghosting going on. I know there's ways to inject newer versions, but do they actually work on Polaris graphics cards, and do they work well? I actually haven't tested it yet, so that's something we'll have to look into in the future. In the meantime, though, it is one downside to these cards is you don't get DLSS. And I know that's a weird thing to say, but honestly, when I've used the two technologies, the only one I actually like is the new Transformer model of DLSS, where you aren't getting the extreme ghosting problems that I found in so many titles that are employing FSR. Anyway, that's just a little bit of a tangent. I'm not a huge fan of the quality change, and personally the ghosting in that instance was pretty extreme. But when we actually just look at the raw performance across the board, everything was playable. City Skylines 2 was edging on this sort of teetering part of playability. I don't really think it's unplayable, but it is ridiculously intensive for the type of game it is. But everything else we tried, GTA 5 Enhanced Edition perfect, GTA 5 Legacy, Counter-Strike 2 perfect, I mean even Cyberpunk 2077, which is probably the last AAA game that I sat down and actually played, worked fantastically on the machine. Yes, you'll have to use lower textures because the cards simply can't keep up with them, but this is very easily masked by turning some things up to medium and high to give the game a really good appearance. So in terms of actual just being able to play all the games that are out there, the RX580 is still king. But the thing is, I say the RX580 is king, and every time someone asks to see these graphics cards tested, there is still a group of people that don't realise the RX580 is the RX480. They are the same card. It just depends whichever one you can get cheapest, because, let's be honest, they are the same performance now. There used to be a tiny performance margin, and in some titles, don't get me wrong, there is still a 1 to 3 FPS margin between the two cards. But in some titles, the performance gap and how much they compare to brand new cards is so minuscule that there really is no change between an RX480 and an RX580. I whacked the RX480 back in my system just to confirm this, and the results show it. So if you are interested in one of these cards, just get whichever one's cheaper. Do not be fussed about getting the 480 or the 580. They are the same. They will both benefit from undervolting. The RX 580 more than the 480 will because they come from worse settings out of the box. They've just got too much voltage pumped into them. But the point regardless. Just get whichever one's cheaper. That's my rant over. That's done. I just wanted to have the data to confirm what I already thought I knew. But my rant's over now, we're all done there. Anyway, what else have we got we can test on the card? Well, we've got OBS support, which, as you'd imagine, it was upgraded for the Polaris range, and the RX 580, once again, I'm going off topic again because it does include the same encoder as the RX 480, which is fairly decent and can manage HEVC, as well as really rather decent quality X264, even in lower bit rates. So if you actually wanted to do some streaming or recording or anything of the sort like that, the RX 480 does make for an excellent media center card. Sorry, RX 580 makes for an excellent media center card, especially in this price range. The RX 460 includes the same encoder, I believe, but will use even less power than this, even more so with an undervolt there as well, so you can alternatively opt for an RX 460 as a media center card, but these both go for the same price, and honestly, I'm sure you could underclock one of these to the stage where it uses the same power as the 460. So as a media center card, they are very solid and can offer you good encode and decode performance on a very minimal budget. Speaking about power consumption though, it is definitely a point worth talking about, given that this came out in an era where everybody was talking about power consumption. It seems like everything went crazy with the R9 290, the 390s, the GTX 780 and all those cards that were just chewing through power, and then suddenly this generation came out and the conversation switched, and we were all talking about power consumption and efficiency, something that seems to have gone out the window in recent years. So in terms of actual power usage out of the box, you're going to be seeing around 176 watts in firm arc, which does work a bit like a power virus on a graphics card and isn't really reminiscent of a real-world scenario, but is exceptionally good for stressing out a card. This firm arc stress test drops to 148 watts when undervolted, and in terms of gaming performance, which is what really matters, we went from 153 watts down to 121 watts. Our idle performance also more than halved itself, which was quite impressive to see, and video playback shaved off around 12 watts, so it's nice to see that you do actually gain quite the decent chunk of power efficiency just from undervolting. Now keep in mind you can go further than this and start underclocking the card, but given this is meant to be reminiscent of what most people that are trying to play games would be doing, we are not going to be going down much further than this. This is also probably quite recreatable because I've done nothing more than tweak the voltages and keep the clocks the same as what they come with out of the box. It's also worth keeping in mind that this Sapphire version is not the best card on the market. I am fairly sure the Pulse range was Sapphire's cost-cut version, and even then it does feel like a premium graphics card, so it is pretty good and does keep itself fairly cool. At least in terms of the averages, when you bring things down undervolted, you're no longer getting up to that thermally throttling area of around 81-82 degrees, which sees the boost clocks on the card start to be a little bit funky and start fluctuating. So whether we were running Furmark or the gaming average here, it really didn't matter what we were doing. As long as we were undervolted, the card stayed under the point where it was thermally throttling. The fans also didn't ramp up anywhere near as much with these settings, which was nice to see, and our idle temperatures dropped as well. Not that the fans actually enable themselves on this card until it gets up to a certain temperature, so it's still silent, but it's going to be running cooler while it's also silent, which is nice to have, and it should preserve the longevity. At least it should do, but who really knows? But there are definitely some people down in the comments, and I know there's some people down there saying, why didn't you test Linux? I love Linux, I do. I think this is a cracking card for Linux. And you are right, I am currently working on a Linux-based test system, but I have awful internet, as I've already repeated, and I am still working on it. It is coming, and I will be doing some dedicated Linux benchmarks on cards we've already looked at. In the meantime, what I can offer you is the Radeon modded drivers. From the R.I.D. team, they used to be the Nemez team, but, you know, they're still pretty good, and some people do swear by these if they are on Vega or Polaris cards. And for me, I didn't really see much beyond a slight increase in Counter-Strike, which was the most substantial one, and then also in some newer titles like Pal World, we did see an increase in performance once again. Most changes were, other than that, in margin of error territory, so yes, you can use the modded drivers, but unless you're running Counter-Strike 2, you're probably better off sticking with the stability of the drivers provided by AMD. These are quality drivers if you are playing Counter-Strike and certain titles, but in some games, for example Crysis, you will see notably worse performance because that's not what they're optimizing for. They are optimizing these cards to just be better in some of those most popular titles out there, and some of those smaller games that are very popular multiplayer titles. So yes, the Radeon modded drivers were good, and they were stable, and they made the card appear as an RX580X, if that even exists. I think it actually might. Who knows? Anyway, the point is, they do work and they do offer some tangible performance increase in a couple of titles. So there we have it, AMD's RX580, and as much as it pains me to say this because we've already heard it so many times over the years, it is still the value king. You can't really dispute it, despite the fact it is an RX480, and we all know it's an RX480. It doesn't matter which version of the card you're getting. They're fantastic. Everybody wants to hate it because it's just that good. They're cheap, they work well, the drivers are solid, there's community support still ongoing for terms of extra support for games like Counter-Strike, you get AMD VCE on there, and you know what? The power consumption on these when undervolted is impressive. It is just genuinely so easy to run this card in any system because let's say you only had a 300 watt power supply. Okay, you drop the clocks, you drop the voltage, you're sorted. You could probably get this thing to run on 300 watts with a Molex to 6-pin probably, just not with the settings it comes with out of the box, because those are stupid. So the RX580, as much as I hold a grudge against how much it's been rebranded, it is a good card. And I think this is probably bargain of the year at this point, because we've only got 2 more months left of the year, and I doubt we're going to top an RX580 for 22 quid. You never know. There's always bargains, there's always time for them to arrive, and I've got a couple of things coming later on this month and start of next month that should also be proposing quite good value in case people are interested. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed watching this video. It's been full of tangents, troubleshooting, undervolting and the likes, but I know lots of people like to see how we get up to the point of benchmarking, so I decided to edit that section down rather than speeding it up and leaving it silent. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and good night.